appreciate the opportunity of being here, particularly the context. I'm deeply aware of the historical nature of this conference, not only this, the first one, and the history flows from then. And I'm quite certain that this history will flow further to take us into a very fruitful outcome. And I have a responsibility to chair this session as well of the genocide by any other name. And I, as my other chairperson said, I'm simply following the process. I would make a brief presentation of 10 to 12 minutes. Then I would invite the other panel members and introduce each of them as they come before you. And I would be very happy to say the title of the session is like genocide by any other name. I would like to add to this by genocide by all means. And I think that's a sub-column to this session that I would say. And my topic is about the genocide of Tamils and the nature of transitional justice in Sri Lanka. When you hear the word, the transitional justice in Sri Lanka, I don't want you to be kind of struck with this idea that we are only in the United Nations, we are talking to the United Nations, or now like in Geneva. It's important we are there, but it is more important we are there in many other places. And I say this as I'm stand before you in two principal grounds. One, as a political scientist, that's my profession. For over about 25 to 27 years, I'm in political science. But also, more importantly, I'm here as my faith in politics. Like, that's much more important than political science. The faith in politics is much more important. And so that's the precise reason that I'm here before you. And the idea of transitional justice for me is that, like, I have very, not simply that, like, to say it deeply is not an appropriate expression. Both personally, academically, and has culturally been involved with the Tamil struggle and never seen it as a separate part to our entity in Tamil Nadu. Then about like the Mulivaikal, something like Mulivaikal happens. And I stand here and reflecting we are in the month of May, and what's ahead for us in 2009 in 17th or 18th of May, and how many of us would have believed that is still politics for us? And then we also needed to speak and reclaim the space, the justice. One, we need to reclaim the space, and another pursuit is that, like, to seek accountability. These are two important components to the transitional justice. And we need to reclaim our space, a political space, a natural space, a legitimacy, and at the same time is also to seek accountability to what has happened. So this combination of these two factors is that it's very important. Another aspect is that in the evidence, the witness presentation and the evidence collection, and I can tell you one very interesting fact about the witness and evidence collection is that in the first evidence that was submitted to the United Nations, the accounts, the process that was done in Tamil Nadu in the University of Madras. And we applied the institutions. We said if these institutions do not serve as the purpose of seeking justice, the human rights account and recording, then why should there be such institutions be established? And why should the public money be spent on these institutions? I mean, like, we want to look at education, public education, with a kind of public accountability. And in that process is that, like, when we went to United Nations in the Human Rights Council, it was very inspiring and it was also very depressing. It's very inspiring because that, for the first time, the small a ventilator, not even windows were open. And then this kind of small ventilators, we had to climb the wall. We had to climb the wall and just to put our, not even put our, it could just be a little nose out and to breathe and say. And at that time, I remember from a very eminent international organization, human rights organization, had come to Chennai and they wanted to talk to me about what happened. Then I said to them, this is a genocide by all means. Then they said, Professor, we want to hear this from another person. The word genocide from another person. And I said, what do you mean by you want to hear from another person? A non-Tamil we want to hear from. And this is precisely as what happened to many, many people in the world. And victims had no voice in this world with politics. And if you are a victim, and the last person that the world would believe is that, want to hear the truth is from you. They want to hear it from another person. If it is much better if it is a white man. And this is how the history of the narrative has happened in the world. The narrative of this whole historical narrative is that then we have to be, in taking this politics is that to the international arena, then we had to peddle at many grounds. We had to peddle at many grounds, then get into this power politics, transitional justice. And getting into the the dynamics of power politics is that, we are going and asking the same international powers which have committed enormous human rights crimes and violations around the world. I mean, in justice, there are no colors. I say this in another country, and I don't see colors to consciousness. I don't see colors to justice. It's kind of very plain truth. Now, in that process is that, we have to go through this power politics. We have to place our faith in the system. Now, in this whole arena is that, and ultimately what the United Nations, when the resolution was passed, and when the United Nations, the 31, the resolution that was passed in 2014 and 15, and then, the international community applauded Sri Lanka for asking that the Sri Lanka was part of the resolution. And where could be the parody of irony of any kind of this thing? The country that committed kind of the mass human rights violations was allowed to be part of the resolution. And then they call this entire resolution as a consensus building. Now, my question is that, this is what is my first question to the international community. There is a very, I don't know how familiar you are about the third world, the banking system. It's very easy to borrow a loan from a bank, but it is very tough to stand as a guarantee for the person who is borrowing the loan. I hope you know that system. If you have to sign a guarantee for a person who is borrowing the loan, you stand to accomplish the burden of that loan if the person fails. But now my question to the international community, which follows, worships International Monetary Fund and World Bank and the system, is that 25 of these countries have stood and said that they are co-signatories to this resolution of 31. Now, what do they have to say at this point? When the United Nations High Commissioner says Sri Lankan government has completely failed in its commitment in accomplishing or even about taking minimal steps towards this fulfillment of a concept and idea called transitional justice. This is not just one country. 25 countries have to explain to the Tamil community. 25 countries have to explain to the international community why have they co-sponsored the resolution, which says that, it's a consensus resolution. What is the meaning of consensus if that consensus is not going to be followed up? This is the most important question we want to raise. And then they also raise the 4 pillars. I would just take another 4 more minutes. I know I have a panel. And they said about 4 pillars in that resolution, which the right to know, the right to justice, the right to reparations, and the guarantee of non-recurrence. But as you know that, since morning from the speakers we are hearing, the right to know includes about the office of missing persons, the status of missing persons. We know the status of that office. Then for the right to justice is that the international court or international judges or the hybrid concept. I mean, none of this has ever been followed up. Then the constitutional mechanism is that the Sri Lankan government has insisted on very simple fact is that Sri Lanka not alone be a federal state, and it will be a completely and unitary system. It is a one state, one race unitary model. So when they are talking about unitary system, the international community has to respond to this. The signatory to the resolution, the co-sponsors to the resolution have to be answerable in the next United Nations Human Rights Council or other international bodies. Then the right to reparation is that we're not asking for any kind of reparations in terms of monetary things. We are asking the land. Let the land, the restoration of, unless about the entire struggle is related to land. What is politics without land? I mean, the whole idea of sovereignty is related to land. And the land is related to culture. Culture is part, the identity. So the entireness of the whole sum is that, like, if 31,000 square miles of kilometers or areas can just be kept under the Sri Lankan government's military, if military can be entered into doing business over the Tamil land, what is this concept of right to reparations? And what is it? What's the meaning of this whole thing? Then the guarantee of non-recurrence is that the very simple fact is that the 13th Amendment, and from 1987, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution has been spoken. And that's what we tell the Indian government in India is that you can't even get a 13th Amendment be passed in Sri Lankan by your influence for all the appeasement, for all the kind of being party to the genocide in Sri Lanka, which Indian government has been. Now, we have not been able to get even 13th Amendment, a constitutional amendment be done. So what do we speak about transitional justice? So that is why I believe this transitional justice, the process should happen at one level, then the politics should be pursued at another level. Because for the simple reason is that there's a very interesting saying that unless you speak truth or acknowledge truth, there is no kind of furthering to any development. Sri Lankan government continues to deny its own role in this whole thing. So the entire truth process is that there is another interesting pattern that in the mass violence and violations of human rights, mass crimes against humanity is that in all this there is a very interesting pattern. The pattern is that unrestrained power enjoyed by the state. But in case of Sri Lanka, I mean, this is in case of in Germany or in case of another countries whether in 1937 in case of Japan over Manchuria, or what you call the Nanking, the massacres in Nanking, and in the world wars and other places, you will find one particular pattern is that the complete concentration of power in the government. But in case of Sri Lanka, it's not even the concentration of power in the government, it is completely the death of a civil society. The death of a civil society is the death of a consciousness. A political society must have certain kind of consciousness. That doesn't prevail. I mean, why I say that does not prevail is that on May 17th or 18th is that there's a wailing of the Tamil people. The wailing of the Tamil people in the streets all over the world. But another nation was celebrating. That precisely told me there is more than one nation in Sri Lanka. How can be just if the people of same country and millions and millions of them are wailing in different parts of the world, one part of the population is celebrating with crackers and celebrating with joy, then there must be more than one nation in that country. So that's the nation. That's the nation we have to reinvent, because that nation we lost by our failure. I want us to acknowledge that. I want us to acknowledge that the fact is that, the Tamils have lost one important fact in the history is that one very, very important, we have ignored our history. Tamils have ignored the history. There is a very interesting fact is that those who ignore history tend to become its victims. We are victims of our own denial of our past and the memory of our sovereignty, memory of our politics. So the transitional justice, no one gives, in politics there is no gift. In politics there is no gift, you have to fight for it. Transitional justice, rest of the world is not going to stand up and say, take your justice in a platter. We have to fight for it. So we have to believe in the institution, we have to strengthen the institutions, we have to strengthen our own political process. And I know I have a time limitations. I want to thank all of you. And I would like to say a very, very brief narrative that happened. The context of young people coming forward to speak here is that there are two factors. One, on 18th of May 2009 in the parliament, Sri Lankan parliament, Rajapaksa, as president, after receiving the delegation from the north, he said to the parliament members, the whole struggle, the Elam struggle today, is stands dissolved. Stands dissolved for the fact that we have had a military, we have inflicted a military defeat on LTTE. But that's not the only thing. For the next 20 years, people who have fought this war and their children may remember this war. And 20 years later, no one would be there to fight this war with us. This is a recorded statement. You can go back and see in the parliament, Sri Lankan parliament recordings. But just in the few years' time, but what that meant is that the younger people should come forward to take the struggle forward. That's the precise thing that we have said this, there's another incident in the India's freedom struggle is that Winston Churchill said to Gandhi that, Mr. Gandhi, in your lifetime and in my lifetime, we will not see the freedom of India. In 1947, when India got free, Churchill was out of power. And the Indian National Congress said that in our lifetime, we have met the goal. So politics, another meaning of politics is that it is a heart of possibilities. So I would like to say that the younger generation is that we Tamils usually suffer from another problem is that we always think our children should be scientists, either a space scientist or about phenomenal, extraordinary intellects and nothing to work with the common problems of our life. So this is another cultural problem of the Tamil community. We have produced many technocrats, many engineers, many scientists, but not as many lawyers who could speak for us. Not as many political scientists who could just go and argue for us. And not as many media people who could just go and write our stories in the thing. And that's what we want to change. And this is what exactly and we need scientists, but we also need people who talk politics in the streets and lawyers, younger people, and then about taking this fight on multiple grounds. And this is where I see the difference about the young people coming forward, and I really appreciate the younger people being part of that.